In this list, we'll go over incredibly niche counter cards that don't specifically list only one card in their name, like anti-raigeki, and go over which ones are the best of this niche bunch. And at number 10, we have Space Cyclone. This is a quick play spell card which only has the ability to detach one Exceeds material from a monster. Now, this is a pretty minor effect, but it is situationally useful against a handful of Exceeds monsters, and technically all of them, I guess. Most of them don't want their Exceeds materials removed. One of the more popular Exceeds monsters, before Master Rule 4, was Castel, the Sky Blaster Musketeer, who is a rank 4 Exceeds monster that requires 2 level 4 materials, and its good effect requires you to detach 2 materials in order to shuffle one face-up card into the deck. So, if you use Space Cyclone on your opponent's Castel as soon as they summon it, they won't be able to spin one of your cards back to your deck, and instead, it will only be able to use its other effect, which is basically a Book of Moon. Or alternatively, if you're playing a card like C88 Gimmick Puppet Disaster Leo, who requires you to have no Exceeds materials as one of its conditions to instantly win the duel, Space Cyclone can be used to remove one of those materials for yourself, as Space Cyclone does not target. So it gets around Disaster Leo's effect, which prevents cards from targeting it. Neither of these situations are super useful though, which is why it's at the lowest spot on this list and doesn't really see any play. And at number 9, we have Synchro Transcend. This is a quick play spell card, which allows you to target one synchro monster your opponent controls in order to special summon a synchro monster from your extra deck that is exactly one level higher than your opponent's monster. But it cannot activate its effect this turn. Now, this card is only really useful if you're playing against a deck that goes into synchro monsters regularly, and it might require you to have an awkward level monsters in your extra deck, as you kind of have to set your extra deck up around using this card. That being the case, if you know you're going against a synchro deck, there are some pretty good synchro monsters you can cheat out of the extra deck with this card, as they will be able to use their effects during your turn. One of the more popular levels of synchro monsters is level 8. So, if your opponent brings out a level 8 synchro monster, you can use this card to cheat out Hot Red Dragon Archifiend Abyss from your extra deck, who is a level 9 synchro monster, which on your next turn will give you an extra negate, which is pretty good. So this card is actually not a half bad counter to some synchro decks, with the two biggest problems of this card being that it does negate the effects of the monster the turn it's brought out, and you have to set up your extra deck around using this card, and also the fact that even if you do set up your extra deck for this card, it itself is not going to be usable against most decks you go against anyway, unless you set up ways to give your opponent synchro monsters. So it's kind of low on this list, even if it can bring out some pretty good monsters. And at number 8, we have Galaxy Storm, another quick play spell card. This one pretty similar to the number 10 spot on this list, in that it interacts with Exceeds monsters, except this one has a little bit of a more useful effect. Basically, with this card, you can target one face-up Exceeds monster on the field, which has no materials, and then destroy that target. So, if your opponent cheats out an Exceeds monster from their extra deck, you can use this card to instantly destroy that card, which doesn't happen very often, but another situation that does happen much more often is an Exceeds monster using the last of its materials pretty quickly, like Castel, the Sky Blaster Musketeer, whose good effect is to detach 2 of its materials immediately, so after it does that, you can then use Galaxy Storm to destroy that card. It won't actually negate its effect, but it will destroy the card on the field after it's already done its job, which isn't super good, but it is a little bit more useful than the number 10 spot, and not as hard to use as the number 9 spot. And at number 7, we have one of the earliest hand traps in the game, and that's the Gravekeeper's Watcher. This card has an effect that can only be activated when your opponent activates a card effect, which has the effect to discard their own cards when it resolves, in which case, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to negate that activation and destroy that card. Now, I should mention, this card can only be activated if your opponent is trying to discard their own cards from their hand, not if they're trying to discard from your hand. Unless an effect is doing both at the same time, like Dark World Dealings for example, or Royal Tribute, which ironically is a Gravekeeper only card that forces both players to discard all the cards from their hand. And it also works against danger monsters, and will actually destroy those cards when negating their effect. So it's much more useful to use Gravekeeper's Watchers on one of them than like an Ash Blossom. Basically, if your opponent activates something which can activate the effects of a Dark World monster, then you can use this card to stop it. Except if it's something like the Gates of Dark World, which this card doesn't work on because of shenanigans with it being a continuous face-up card or something. And it surprisingly can be used against cards like Mind Crush, since it does have a negative effect which can potentially make the user of the card discard one card from their hand, as this card checks for the potential end result of the card before it negates it, even if the end result of the card isn't clear that it will send a card from your hand to the graveyard. It's kind of a complicated niche counter card that did see some play in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's kind of been power cut by some of the more power hand traps we have today, so it's not really used as there's just much better generic cards. And it's not really something that counters something that's super important anyway, except in very niche situations, like if your opponent is running Mind Crush. And at number 6, we have Engraver of the Mark. Now, this is a pretty unique counter card, where it can negate the effect of a card which declares exactly one card name, in which case you can declare a different card name and then change that card name to the other card name. So, for example, if your opponent plays Mind Crush and then declares one card name that's probably in your hand, because you probably just added it through a search or something, you can then chain Engraver of the Mark to that Mind Crush in order to force your opponent to choose a new target, something that's definitely not in your hand, which will cause that card to not resolve correctly and force them to take the negative effect of Mind Crush. Or if your opponent is using Prohibition, a card which allows them to declare a name and then prevent you from using that card, you can use this card to change it to something that's probably in their deck instead of yours. Now, there are not too many popular cards which require you to declare exactly one card name, so it's a pretty niche counter card, which is why it fits perfectly on this list. And it also has a quick effect on the field if you don't decide to use this card as a hand trap, where you can target any face-up card in the field and then destroy it during the end phase of the next turn. Now, since this is a quick effect and doesn't require this card to remain on the field to resolve the effect, you can just target one of your opponent's cards during your turn, and then target another one immediately during your opponent's turn, and then just keep targeting cards of this card's effect until your opponent gets rid of it, which will then eventually destroy those cards during the end phase of the next turn. Now, this destruction effect isn't super good, but it's not bad either. Kind of falls squarely into the annoying category, where your opponent will probably want to get rid of this card if they aren't confident about winning the game in the next turn. But seeing as most decks can win the game in basically one turn, I could totally see decks just ignoring the effect and doing their combos like normal, or just getting rid of the monsters that are targeted with this effect with their normal combo plays, so the effect never actually goes off. It's a pretty unique effect, and I don't think either of its effects are shared by any other cards in the game. And at number 5, we have Dimension Fortress Weapon. This is a dark level 4 machine type monster, which means it's a target for Black Salvo, and has the counter effect, where cards cannot be sent from the deck to the graveyard. Now, most meta decks like to send cards from their deck to the graveyard, and there's even a lot of cards in the ban list whose sole purpose is just to send cards from the deck to the graveyard. This card actually has a pretty useful effect against a lot of decks. The only problem with this card is that it's a monster card, which needs to stay on the field and doesn't have any other kind of inherent protection or special summoning. So you'd have to bring this card out in some other way, or use up one of your normal summons for it, and then protect it since it only has 1700 attack. So it can be beaten over by any halfway decent extra deck monster, or just high attack level 4 monsters. That being said, your opponent might have to use up their battle phase or some kind of removal effect in order to get rid of this card, since it does hamper a lot of decks, which is why it gets the middling spot on this list. It's both a niche counter card that counters a niche which is used by a lot of decks, but not so useful that it actually sees play. And at number 4, we have GB Hunter, a card very similar to Dimension Fortress Weapon, and actually did see some competitive play in the past. Now, this card's only effect is that cards in the field cannot be returned to the deck. Now, there was a very popular archetype called Gladiator Beasts, whose effects all revolved around the battle phase, where, after they attacked, during the end of the battle phase, they would return themselves to the deck in order to special summon another Gladiator Beast monster from their deck, who would then gain their effects. So with GB Hunter on the field, they would not be able to return to the deck and activate their effects, which is why this card is called the GB Hunter. It's not so subtly hitting at the fact that this card was created to shut down Gladiator Beasts. Now, this card also works against a handful of other cards, and any bounce effect that targets an extra deck monster. If your opponent uses Compulsory Evacuation Device, they won't be able to target one of your extra deck monsters with its effect if you have GB Hunter on the field, because that card can only return extra deck monsters back to the extra deck, since they can't go to the hand. And it also stops effects like Castel, the Sky Blaster Musketeer, since its Detach 2 effect is to return a card to the deck. Now, none of this is super useful in today's game, as Gladiator Beasts are kind of a rogue tier deck, and this card wasn't super useful at stopping them anyway, despite its name, but it did once see competitive play, so it kind of has to take a top spot over all the other cards so far, as it's a good example of a niche counter card that saw play because its niche just happened to be one of the meta decks. And at number 3, we have the only counter trap card on this list, and that's Retort. Now, technically, counter trap cards are all about countering your opponent, so I tried to leave pretty much all of them off this list, as there are a lot of incredibly specific counter trap cards. But that's kind of the point of them, and Retort is not really an exception to those. It's a really niche counter trap card which has the effect where, if your opponent activates a spell or trap card, which has the same name as a spell or trap card in your graveyard, you can negate and destroy that card. Then, add one card from your graveyard to your hand with that name. So, this card can only be activated if your opponent is using a card that you yourself have used previously and put in the graveyard, or that got milled there in some way. So, it's an incredibly hard card to pull off, and not really something you can plan for, except in one circumstance. Because you see, this card does occasionally see competitive play, because it serves one really good niche, and that is the niche of mirror matches. A mirror match is just when you and your opponent are playing the same deck. So, if you're playing against an opponent who is using the same deck as you, there is a really good chance you are going to be sharing a lot of the same spell or trap cards. In which case, this card will allow you to both negate and destroy one of your opponent's cards, and add a card back to your hand, making this negate a +1 in card advantage. Which is really good because negates in themselves are already good on their own, but gaining advantage for that negate is even better. This card is only ever played in the side deck, and it's only ever swapped into the main deck if you know you're going against a mirror match in round 2, basically. And even then, only against decks that use the same spell or trap cards, as it doesn't work on monster effects. If this card did work on monster effects, it might see more play, as you could just use it on hand traps or something. But since it's only spell or traps, it's a little bit more limited, but even then still occasionally sees play as a good mirror match counter. And at number 2, we have Big Burn. This card can only be activated when your opponent activates a card that targets a monster in the graveyard, in which case this card will banish all monsters in both players' graveyards. So essentially, this card will get rid of all of the monsters in the graveyard, so they can't resolve the card, which is targeting that monster in the graveyard, and is a really good counter card against decks that want monsters in the graveyard, which is basically all of them. A lot of the top decks want their monsters to exist in the graveyard, and in fact, the graveyard is basically a second hand for a lot of decks. So, if your opponent is targeting monsters in the graveyard, you can then use Big Burn to get rid of all of them, which is why this card occasionally sees play. Only occasionally though. You'd think a card which is really good against a lot of meta decks would see more play. But the tricky thing about Big Burn is in its activation requirement. A lot of decks like to send their cards to the graveyard and then use their effects in the graveyard, but not a lot of them like to target their monsters in the graveyard. So if your opponent uses something like Monster Reborn, which does target a card in the graveyard, you can then chain Big Burn to get rid of the graveyards. Although that's a one-off in most decks, if players even need to use Monster Reborn, as a lot of the cards that manipulate themselves in the graveyard don't actually need other cards to target them in order to do things. So even though it has a good effect, and it's a pretty decent counter card, it's slightly too niche to see very much competitive play. In addition to the fact that most decks don't want to banish their own graveyards either. It would only really work in a specific deck that doesn't really care if the monsters in their graveyard get banished. And at number 1, we have Gemini Imps. This card is kind of like the reverse of Gravekeeper's Watcher, in that it's a hand trap that can only be activated when your opponent activates the effect of a card, which would cause you to discard a card from your hand. In which case, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to negate the effect, destroy the card, then draw one card. Now, that last effect, where it allows you to draw a card after doing its negate, is what makes this card the best niche counter card on this list, and something a lot of these other cards should probably do as well. As if you're able to counter the specific thing from this card, you get to do so while gaining advantage, which is always a huge plus. Exactly the same as Retort, except Gemini Imps is a hand trap, so it's easier to use than Retort, which is a counter trap card that you have to set up for a turn before it becomes live. Now, Gemini Imps sees play basically anytime there is a meta deck which discard cards from your opponent's hand. So back during the wind-up hand loop days, Gemini Imps saw lots of competitive play, as it was a great counter to those decks. And it also saw play during the Topologic Gumblar Dragon hand loop format, as it was a great one-stop counter to that pretty good combo, which could get rid of most of the cards in your starting hand. Although that's kind of the crux of this card as well. Konami doesn't like cards which can get rid of all the cards in your opponent's hand. So they usually ban cards which allow those kinds of combos to happen. So Gemini Imps is only ever heavily played right before a ban list comes in and stops whatever this card was good against, because the effects to discard cards from your opponent's hand is pretty rare, and not a lot of decks try to go for that as part of their normal strategy, unless they're trying to get rid of all the cards in your hand. So it's a pretty niche counter card that occasionally sees heavy play during hand loop formats, and then almost no play outside of those once the problem cards get banned, and is a great poster boy for the whole point of this list. Alright, and that's the end of the list. If you think there's any other niche counter cards that should have been on this video, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. And did you know only 26.4% of people who watch these videos are subscribed to the channel?